Welcome to the very first episode of Between You and Me. My name is Michelle Pini, and we will be discussing all things media, plus a little bit of politics today with a media legend. Here with me is former editor of The Age and current director of Inside PR. Thank you for joining me, Mike Smith.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Lovely to be here with you.
So, Mike, just so our listeners can find out a little bit more about you, tell me a little bit about your background.
Well, I spent 25 years in newspapers, all of it at The Age, and I did just about every job there, ranging from typing up women's bowls results in my first week to editing the paper for the last 3 years, finishing in 1994. And now I've spent 25 years in public relations and communications and crisis management. So a quarter of a century in newspapers, quarter of a century from the other side. Sometimes I think I'm just starting to get a balanced view of the world.
So you actually started, I think, as a cadet, is that right?
Yeah, in the days when there were cadets straight out of school. I consider that I got my education at The Age because this was probably 1969. It was in the Perkin era when The Age was undoubtedly the best newspaper in Australia and one of the best 20 in the world as measured by Columbia University, New York. It was a golden era for newspapers, and I was in heaven. I was surrounded by all my heroes. We sat in the room together. We heard each other's telephone conversations. We didn't have computers, and we went down the pub and swapped yarns. And as a kid, I learnt everything in that newsroom and in the bars around Melbourne, and got my education in all kinds of ways, including my political education. I didn't do a university degree, so I went in there at 17 years of age with no formed political views. My political views, to the extent that I have any, were shaped by walking the streets and talking to politicians and learning at the feet of some great journalists.
Interesting, because of course that model has changed greatly in the time since you were editor of The Age. How do you define, or can you define, where the media sits today in terms of, I guess, speaking to the public and listening to the public?
It's a very different world. I mean, when I started, newspapers were the main source of news. They had high credibility, high trust, and great penetration. When I started in newspapers, there were about 1.5 million papers being sold every year, 2 morning papers and an afternoon paper, in a city of not much more than 2 million. So huge penetration, huge trust, because it was the principal source of news, and newspapers had just begun to change because of television, from moving from merely reporting the news to more explanation and analysis. And that was an exciting time in newspapers, because journalists, including young journalists like me, got an opportunity once you'd earned your stripes to write comment and features and get bylines. I mean, bylines were a relatively new thing. So it's a great place for young journalists in that time of change. And of course, since then, things have changed much more dramatically, with the internet stealing newspapers' audience, stealing its revenue, and newspapers have... some of them have gone in the direction of reinforcing the need for commentary and analysis by respected writers. Others have chased clickbait and sort of went a bit down market, thinking that that they could push readers and advertisers to the online space, but that's failed. Advertisers, the advertising revenue online is much smaller than it was in newspapers. And another mistake that some newspapers made was to give away their news for free online. A lot of people got used to free news and are very reluctant to buy online subscriptions. So newspapers are in trouble now, but I'm a bit more optimistic now than I was even a year ago, because when I look at what's happening in the American and British markets, and we tend to follow those in many industries, especially in newspapers, people are starting to drift back to trusted mastheads and trusted reporters like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the London Times. The quality papers are starting to recover, and trust in social media, which has stolen newspapers' lunch, has dropped dramatically in the last 12 months, and that's been measured already because of the fake news syndrome and of course Facebook's disaster in letting the data of millions of people out into places where it shouldn't be. So, I think this is I think there may be a bit of a line in the sand now in the decline of newspapers, and we may even see a little bit of an uptick now because the social media craze has peaked, and there's now less people using Facebook and less people getting their news from Facebook, but more importantly, not trusting the news from Facebook anymore.
But it's the online mastheads now that they're looking to, isn't that right?
Yeah, well, they are, because if they can shift readers and advertisers to the online space, that's much more profitable. Because the cost of newsprint and delivery systems for hard copies is the cost is very high, but it can only work if they can get enough subscribers and advertisers paying enough money online to finance it. But that's the general strategy. But they made mistakes in the beginning of the internet, and they're still recovering from those mistakes. And some will do it better than others. I mean, some have diminished their brand by what they've done in the online space. Those who have stuck to quality and invested in quality products, they're the ones that seem to be doing better than the others, and that's particularly the case already in America and England, on which our newspapers have always been based, and it's starting to happen here as well.
That's good for Independent Australia, certainly. But, okay, so let's go then to our national broadcaster and the scenario that's unfolding there. Because until recently anyway, they were considered the most trusted news source. Is that right?
Yeah, and they still are. When you line up the ABC against newspapers, people still say they trust the news on the ABC more, and that's, I think that's because, particularly in regional and country areas, the ABC reports it straight. There's a lot of commentary on the ABC in the metro markets, but mostly the ABC is straight news, and then there's this huge argument about how they treat political news. But for many years, the ABC was kind of the poor cousin in the media space. I remember when I was a young journalist, the ABC people were paid less. Sometimes we had to buy their beers, shout them beers. They were always underfunded by the government, but now they've got the best business model of all, because they've got government-guaranteed government money, and the newspaper publishers don't like that. They're hurting. But if you look at the history of the ABC, Sir Keith Murdoch always opposed even the formation of the ABC because he saw it as a commercial threat. Warren Denning, the great ABC Canberra journalist, established the ABC's Canberra Bureau and the first independent news service run by the ABC. Previously, the ABC just read stuff out of newspapers. They took a service from the newspapers. The newspapers liked that. They didn't like the ABC becoming independent. Keith Murdoch campaigned against it, but he lost that campaign. And so right from the start, the newspaper publishers, particularly the Murdochs, have been against the existence of the ABC as a news service.
Well, that certainly hasn't changed.
No, it hasn't changed. It's got more acute in recent years because the ABC is doing rather well online. And it gets, it's the ABC website is top 10 of all websites, news websites in the country. And the ABC actually reacted to the internet world much more quickly and effectively than the newspapers. they went into digital broadcasting and iView and all kinds of other things, innovative things, much more quickly and much more effectively than newspapers did. And that gave them even greater audience reach. And the newspapers don't like it. They think that they've got a government subsidy to gobble up the newspaper industry space. So we've gone from this poor cousin to a kind of a totem of envy, if you like, or resentment, at least from newspaper publishers these days, towards the ABC. And that's why particularly the Murdoch organisation is campaigning against the ABC, trying to destroy its credibility and trust by labelling as a left-wing organisation.
And yet the government is also, well, certain members of the government seem to be lobbying against the ABC.
And it's always been the case. Whether it's Liberal or a Labor government, the ABC will always have enemies in government. And to me, that's how it should be. You know, I think an independent, effective news organisation needs to be almost anti-government, whatever government's in power, because that's their role. Their role is to be a watchdog on government, whatever the colour of that government. And of course, the people on the end of that criticism or that critique is going to claim bias, and that's what's happened in the ABC's history. The ABC has had attacks from Labor people when Labor's in power. So it's not a new thing, it's not a different thing, but I think it's probably particularly fierce at the moment.
So let's say, having been editor of The Age, you understand the machinations, I guess, the pressure that comes from government and from rival organisations. What would you do if you were managing director, or if you were actually in charge of running the ABC? How would you approach it? And do you think that Michelle Guthrie is doing perhaps all that she can?
Well, Michelle Guthrie gave a good speech to the Melbourne Press Club a couple of weeks ago. A good sort of strong defence of the ABC and its qualities and its reason for being. She perhaps should do a bit more of that. I know some within the ABC certainly think she should do more. I think that's probably right, but I see her point that she shouldn't be out there every day. When she is out there, she should have something to say, something new, something powerful, something effective. I think people get a bit bored when they see the same faces on television every day, particularly politicians saying nothing. Politicians should appear less on television themselves. They should only appear when they've got something to say.
Now that I would definitely go for.
I'd like to see the ABC board being stronger in defence of the organisation without necessarily getting into individual complaints, but in principle defending the ABC and its record in the media environment. Problem with that is that it's the government that appoints board members, and there's a perception that they're beholden to the government, and the government is probably putting pressure on them behind the scenes to, in their words, pull the ABC into line. So it's I'd certainly like to see a board that defends the ABC in this kind of persistent attack that's happening at the moment.
And yes, that's true that perhaps she shouldn't go out there and speak when she has nothing to say. However, she is largely unavailable, I think, to the media. I mean, that's something that John Fain also brought up on the day. So what do you make of that? I mean, is that because what is it that they don't want to discuss? That's, I think, what most people think when there's no communication.
Well, I don't think there's any mileage in Michelle Guthrie having a daily tennis match with every politician that criticised the ABC, because some of the criticism is plainly ridiculous, and that can be handled by the normal complaints mechanism in the ABC. I'd think she perhaps should do a bit more, but I don't think she should be available to every ABC interviewer, television, radio, online, who wants to talk to her every day. That's not her job. She should be out there when necessary. She should do it strategically, not too often, but do it when it's necessary.
Do you think she might be in over her head?
Too early to say. I think we won't be able to really pass judgment on Michelle Guthrie's reign for another year or two. I think Michelle Guthrie's main roles are to get a fair budget in the arm wrestle with government in the funding rounds. I think she'll be judged on that. She'll be judged on how she allocates resources because you can't have unlimited resources put into the ABC. Some things have got to give if you want to do new things. And innovation is another key. You've got to do new things all the time. You've got to be nimble. You've got to be smart in the modern media environment. And I think the ABC record on that is pretty good. And she's already got a couple of runs on the board with that as well, with some good sort of podcasting and community engagement programs and some good Australian drama. So I think that's going along pretty well. She's also got to make sure that internally the culture of the ABC is aggressive, competitive, professional, and they're not distracted by other things. Her job is to protect the staff from those sort of things. Similarly, like a managing director protects editors from external noise on occasions. So I think so far so good with Michelle Guthrie, but the jury will be out for another couple of years to get a proper assessment of what sort of job she's done.
Yep. Definitely. All right. So let's move then to the government's, which were actually supported by Labor as well, new secrecy laws. What do you think they mean, basically, for the media in general?
Oh, look, the media will squeal, as they should, with any law that inhibits freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the freedom of the press. And they should campaign vigorously against any laws that do that. And I think you'll find that the usual pattern is that they will do their squealing, which they are, and there will be some relaxation by the government to appease the media, because you don't want to go into an election with all the major media companies against you on any issue. So
we've seen that before, in fact.
Absolutely, yeah. And it will happen, and there will be a reasonable compromise. The government will say that the laws are still effective and they haven't been diminished, and the media will say we've got some concessions that do guarantee our freedoms to a reasonable extent. But there'll always be the fight and there'll always be the compromise.
But what do you make of the fact that both sides of the political spectrum actually support these stronger protections, as they like to phrase them, although as many of us like to say, infringements?
Well, one of the very few issues on which you can get bipartisan support is national security, and there is.
Which explains Labor's reluctance to criticise. And
they, both sides of politics, respect the confidential briefings they get from people like our spy agencies and Foreign Affairs and Defence. And usually that means there is advice from people like that these laws are necessary. And then you get that bipartisan approach, because no political party wants to be seen as soft on national security or as doing things that diminish the safeguarding of the nation. That's why there is that bipartisan support. We don't know exactly what they're basing their views on, because we're not privy to those confidential briefings, and nor should we be. But that's how it happens. But even within that sort of scenario, there's a bit of room to move to at least meet in part some of the concerns of the big media organisations.
And so
And
speaking...
sometimes there's a trade-off. And media companies, for instance, in the past have traded off losing something for getting better defamation laws, for instance. Sometimes there's a deal.
Yes, but what does it actually mean for our democracy in terms of... Let's take the example at the moment of Witness K and Colliery, his lawyer, and the fact that under new... I mean, he's actually being prosecuted, which is probably unheard of for somebody in the position that he was in as Attorney General, I believe, at one point of New South Wales, and also as a director of ASIS. So under current law, the new changes, I believe, that will be coming in, they would be going to jail for much longer if they're found to have somehow broken those conditions. What do you make of that? I mean, is that a direction that we should be happy to be following?
No, I think the charging of the lawyer breaks perilous new ground, and the legal profession has made that clear. And the fact that penalties for that sort of offence against that sort of person could be so harsh is very troubling. And that's a bit different from media freedom arguments on some other aspects of the laws, but that charging that lawyer is would seem to me, unless there's things we don't know about, would seem to be an outrageous crossing the line.
And in fact, some might say that there are others that should in fact be charged for the things that he exposed.
The perpetrators.
The perpetrators, minor detail.
But I mean, the fact is that people who work in spy agencies and national security agencies are able to do things that none of us are able to do. But this was what they did in Indonesia was should have been exposed, and I think would have been exposed in the United States a lot earlier. Activities like that have been exposed many times in the United States, but we've seen what the United States, the extent they go to punish people who reveal dirty national security,
like Julian Assange.
Yeah,
and our government.
Yeah, I mean,
both sides of government there too. Neither side has actually stepped up to represent him or advocate for him in any way.
No, nor has the media here. He hasn't had many friends in the media, which has surprised me, because I think there are principles there that are worth exploring and explaining and supporting. The longer that Julian Assange stays in detention, it's a media freedom failure in Australia that the industry has not been more vocal about Julian Assange.
And you know, I mean, there's just so many instances at the moment. We've just heard that the government of Nauru has banned the ABC of all organisations from reporting on the asylum seeker situation there. And yet News Corp, well, we won't go into whether their reporting has been biased or not, but News Corp will be the only organisation allowed entry. What do you make of that? Are we in a parallel universe?
That's what it is. I mean, that's the right of nations and particularly despotic nations to let in whoever they like. But, you know, the ABC is resourceful enough to get a coverage of what's happening there without being on the spot.
Yes, but should our government, who is actually, I believe, paying money to have those centres, should they step in, or is that really
they should
counterproductive?
They should protest, and they should protest strongly on behalf of the national broadcaster. But really,
I won't hold my breath.
There's nothing they can do about it. There's nothing they can do to force another nation on sovereignty, but they should be protesting in the strongest possible terms. And the fact that they have not done that tells you a lot about the government's attitude to the ABC.
Indeed. Just moving on a little bit from those issues of national security and freedom of speech. So Malcolm Turnbull is, I believe, on his 35th news poll loss in a row at the moment, after having deposed, of course, his predecessor at 30. How do you think he's travelling at the moment?
Well, he's got problems, but they're not, in my view, they're not insurmountable problems. He can still win. Last news poll, there was a 2-point difference, 49 to 51, two-party preferred. Fairfax Ipsos poll, I think maybe 4 points between them. Those sort of margins are almost within statistical error. They're very close. And it's not unusual for a government to be behind at this stage of the cycle, and plenty of governments have come from this position to win. So...
But no government has actually won after 30 losses in a row, I believe, yet.
Well, they're opinion polls. They're not real polls. There's no reason why Malcolm Turnbull can't win, because he's within 2 points on a two-party preferred basis, polling hasn't been going on for all that many years, so I don't pay much attention to a record bad poll in historical terms. Everything depends on what happens from here. There'll be, there's still some budget legislation to get through. There's still some policy announcements to come before the election. Bill Shorten has been performing really well for the last 12 months, but has stumbled recently.
It's been reported as a spectacular stumble. Would you say that that's a fair way to categorise it?
Yeah, because we're talking about billions of dollars worth of redistribution here, and he fumbled an answer. Now, whether he answered that question at the press conference in ignorance or it was a slip-up, doesn't matter. It had to be reversed, and it was reversed quickly and maybe forgotten quickly, or maybe not. If he stumbles again, then he'll become known as a stumbler. But he's performed really well against a government that has made a lot of errors in the last couple of years. But it's close. It's too close to call now. Either side can win. The winner will be decided in the next few months.
Do you think that Malcolm Turnbull is a bit of a poster boy for the press in general in terms of his backflips, which I think are at a record at the moment? Recently, they were categorised after only 7 months, I believe, in government at 17 backflips. And I'm sure he's exceeded that, although I haven't done a recent count. And yet we don't hear a great deal about Malcolm Turnbull's backflips, which do include major policy issues such as the environment, climate change in particular, human rights, and of course we had the marriage, same-sex marriage debate, and a very different direction in that. What do you make of that?
Well, we heard a lot about those backflips in the first year and a half of his prime ministership, and that's the main reason why he fell behind in the polls for so long. So as far as backflips go, Malcolm Turnbull's been an acrobat. But
indeed,
with the news cycle, so rapid these days, that's all in the past. Whereas Bill Shorten's got a fresh backflip. That's the backflip of the week. But what happens next week, we'll never know. But yeah, I mean, Malcolm Turnbull's got a great flipper, and Shorten's been in opposition, which in it's difficult being in opposition, but there are some advantages. You don't have to be too specific. You're not running the country. You don't have to be too specific on anything. You can talk on principles. It'll get a bit tougher for Shorten during the election campaign when he has to announce specific policies and try and sell them. When Shorten's taken advantage of the government's problems over the last couple of years extremely well, and kept ahead in the polls. But we're about to enter the last furlong of a Melbourne Cup race, and that's where the race is won and lost.
What about the mechanisms behind deposing Malcolm Turnbull within his own party, such as, of course, Tony Abbott, who's been very vocal again of late? Do you think that's one of the reasons why perhaps Malcolm Turnbull is the preferred Prime Minister, certainly in terms of the Fourth Estate, because of the alternatives? Well, yeah, I mean,
that's a separate poll. Who's the preferred Prime Minister? And that becomes a very personal, individual thing. And I think the fact that Turnbull's been so far in front on that for most of the last couple of years says more about Shorten than about Turnbull. It means we're not sure about Shorten. We don't know enough about him yet. We don't know whether he's up for the job. We know Turnbull is smart. He got there. He's holding power. So at the moment we prefer him. But when it comes to a general election, you are voting for a party as well as an individual. The preferred Prime Minister poll is significant, but it's not as significant as the two-party preferred vote. And I think we have to remember that two-party preferred is a function of preferences, and that's where preferences of the smaller parties, particularly the Greens, are important. They'll go mostly to Labor. Who knows where One Nation's preferences will go to, and there'll be other independents that will share preferences as well. So they're two different polls, but the one that decides who's government is the two-party preferred one.
Do you think there'll be a Lib spill?
A
Liberal leadership spill?
No, I don't think. I think both the present leaders are safe until the next election, because they've both learnt that dumping leaders willy-nilly is not liked or admired or even respected by the voters. They want to see some stability, and that's why both will survive until the next election, barring a huge scandal. But the loser won't have the job after the next election.
Fair enough. All right. Well, Mark Smith, thank you so much for speaking to us today on Between You and Me.
It's been a pleasure, Michelle.